This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
We move off this thing from X was said on Twitter today to the owner of X said this, or the owner of Facebook or Meta said this. And that's the huge step change that we're seeing. And how do you even quantify that? How do you put a figure on an Elon Musk tweet as an act of political interference? Like, I don't know the answer to that.
Hello, I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder, the podcast that tries to find order in our mad, and in 2025, really increasingly mad world. And this week, I'm in the host seat, and I am delighted to be talking here to Peter Geoghegan. Peter is an Irish investigative journalist, an expert on corruption, and as our regular listeners will know and our new listeners can understand, this really ties into the overarching idea of this podcast on global disorder, because we seek to make connections between the areas that are most conspicuously disordered, like Ukraine or Libya, and the wider global trends that shape the system in which these problems arise, including kleptocracy, the flows of dark and dodgy money which are truly global, and then the links between these trends and neo-populism, because there seems to be an irony here that many people do have this sense that politics is corrupt, and yet sometimes they end up turning to parties that promise simple solutions and that sometimes are even backed by people whose income is somewhat questionable. Peter is really well placed to talk to us about all of this, so I'm massively glad to have him here to pick his brains. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Jane. I'm delighted to be back.
Well, we're very happy you've come back because you were here with Jason in the early days back in episode 7, talking about the influence of dirty money on British politics in particular. But before we get into some of this juicy stuff, tell us a bit about yourself. Where did your interest in these issues come from? I imagine when you were 10 years old, you didn't think you would be exposing corruption and the dark web distorting our democracy. How did you come down this path?
I didn't think I was going to be doing this when I was 30 years old or even older, maybe 35. I, in many ways, really fell into this subject area. Like, it was back in 2016. I was working as what's called a stringer, which is a journalist who writes for newspapers and gets paid by the word. I was working as a stringer for lots of people, but including the Irish Times. And it was the run-up to the Brexit referendum, and I actually was based in Scotland at the time. My editor said, if you go down to Sunderland and before the referendum happens, write a colour piece from the north of England, what it's like, what are people thinking, what are they talking about. And I went down, I wrote my piece, I spent some time with people, very Brexity, it was interesting, had good chats with people. And I was coming back, and I was at the train station, and there was a copy of the Metro. And I had a big wraparound ad that said, vote Leave, take back control, which is the official slogan of the Leave campaign. And on the back of it was the logo of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. And this ad was paid for by the DUP. And I was like, that's a very strange thing. I used to work in Belfast. I'd reported on the DUP and Northern Irish politics for years. I was like, why are the DUP buying adverts in Sunderland? That's it's not the kind of thing they normally would do. And I took a picture of it. I took sent out back in the day, I sent a tweet, which I don't really do anymore. And I kind of forgot about it. And a few months later, Adam Ramsey, who's a journalist at Open Democracy, got in touch saying, I heard you're interested in DUPs. election spending. I'd seen my tweet. She was interested. The two of us did a story together, did a big investigation looking at the DUP's money and the Brexit referendum. And we discovered that political donations in Northern Ireland were secret. Some money, about almost £500,000, had been routed through Northern Ireland and spent anonymously on various election campaigning in the last few days running up to the Brexit referendum. So it's kind of crucial period running up to the Brexit referendum. The money had come from a guy who lived in the outskirts of Glasgow, who'd been in business with, it was like something from an airport novel, had been in business with the head of Saudi secret intelligence and a Danish gun runner and all this other crazy stuff.
You couldn't make it up.
You couldn't make it up stuff, Jane. But it also got me thinking more generally about, like, how does influence work in politics? How do you buy influence? How does it work?
But I'm sure you're not alone, that many, many people have paid more attention to some of these issues since the Brexit referendum, since the Trump election. But then I also wonder, how do you get beyond just a sense that all of democracy is dodgy? How do you try to cut through and get people to understand that there are things that can be done, that it doesn't always have to be like this?
That's one of the aspects I think that's really challenging with a lot of doing this work. And are you just feeding into a wider cynicism, which is there, you can see it. And I guess I come at it from a perspective that one of the things I think that the kind of populist right has been very good at, and Donald Trump is very good at, and so is Nigel Farage, is actually going, this whole thing is a charade. And actually, yes, democracy is for sale. And you can trust me because it's transactional. I'm telling you it's transactional.
Right.
So if you look at Donald Trump, pure transaction. And similarly with Nigel Farage, you might go, like, people on the Liberal left go, but Nigel Farage, he earns £500,000 as a MP. He's the highest paid MP by a mile. People in Clacton must be disgusted at that. My read, I'm not in Clacton, I haven't been, but my sense is a lot of people go, good for him. I look at it and say, the problem is how our democratic system has been set up in terms of the amount of access and how access has basically become a kind of just, it's not a problem that we have. We don't have a problem with access capitalism, both in the centre left and the centre right. And I think people are appalled by that. People, if you talk to ordinary voters, they really hate that. They hate the people can buy access with money. They hate the fact that, the Conservatives had their leaders group where if you paid £50,000 a year, you got 4 private dinners with the Prime Minister and a bunch of senior cabinet ministers. They hate that. And that's where I come at it with this idea when I think about how to not feed cynicism. It's often, I think, about being able to say, look, the problem is how these systems are operating. I did a story yesterday. I now run a new outfit called Democracy for Sale, like my book. And we're all about telling these stories. And we revealed a story yesterday, which was about a name that I'm sure listeners are familiar with, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yes.
Yevgeny Prigozhin was a head of the Wagner Group. In 2010, he was sanctioned by the British government for activities to do with Wagner in Libya. That same year, Elliot Higgins, who set up Bellingcat, published a series of investigations that showed lots of links between really tangible, like not just circumstantial links, financial links between Prigozhin and the GRU, Russia's intelligence arm. Elliot Higgins since tweeted out these stories. Prigozhin then took a libel action in London against Elliot Higgins. He was under sanctions at the time. The libel action was, he said, he'd been defamed and he'd been caused great distress by saying that he was the head of the Wagner Group. This terrible, terrible lie was a slur on his person and caused him great harm. He was given special dispensation by the British government to hire a London law firm to help him do this. Because he was under sanctions, he couldn't open a bank account in Britain, he couldn't own property, but actually he was given special licenses by the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation to hire this law firm to sue Elliot Higgins. The case was eventually struck out not long after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and Prigozhin went over to fight in the front line with his Wagner troops. So
gave the game away a bit.
They kind of gave the game away. But what we revealed yesterday on Democracy for Sale is that the Solicitors Regulatory Authority had launched an investigation after Elliot Higgins complained, as you would do. If you'd spent, as Elliot had, £70,000 of his own money, which he's never going to see again because Prigozhin died in a fireball in Russia after crossing Putin, as many of your listeners will also remember. This is money Elliot Higgins is never going to see again. He complains to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, which is the body that kind of supposed to oversee solicitors, that this is what we call a SLAP case, a strategic litigation against public participation. It takes 2 full years for the SRA to come up with a 5-page report in which they decide no further action needs to be taken, no rules have been broken, and the London law firm, which has since been wound up, has done nothing wrong. And that, I think, is exactly the kind of thing that people look at and go, what's going on? How have we ended up in a situation where the supposed checks and balances to protect various aspects of our democracy, whether that's electoral politics or the way the rich and the powerful can use the law courts to silence people, these are all things that I think ordinary people have a problem with. And we have got into a situation where lots of these organs do not work. We need to try and reform these. And my fear is in failing to do this, and the more we fail to do this, it only gives more grist to the Nigel Farage and Donald Trumps of this world, who can turn around and say, look, the game is rigged, but I'm telling you it's straight. In some ways, you can trust me because you can't trust me.
Some of these problems, including the libel issues, do seem to be particularly acute here in the UK. And I really wonder, why do you think that is? I mean, I think traditionally from Britain, people often looked at the US and thought, oh, there's too much money in American politics, but we're not like that. But then the US has got certain things like having to register if you're lobbying for a foreign government and at least disclose what meetings you had. I don't know if it's partly that we have these old kind of ideas of a gentleman's code. I find it interesting after all the cash for questions stuff years ago, you had the Nolan principles on public life. So everyone has to sign up to basically having integrity when they are in public life. But that really requires a system where people, they take their values seriously and they feel bound by those. And that doesn't necessarily fit with the reality that we see today. So, what's going on with Britain?
What we've seen in the UK in recent years, when I first started doing this work, I thought the exact same as you're saying there. Look, compared to America, this is nothing. These are small amounts of money. As I say, £50,000 for the Tory leaders group gets you these meetings. That wouldn't even get you a meeting at a down ticket race in Ohio. Get you nothing. But actually, a couple of things happen with that. One is, because there's not that much money, the political economy, and because we don't have a habit of giving money to politics, you've got a very small amount of money that everyone's chasing after. So the political economy, it's very small. I write a lot about think tanks and not who don't declare their donors, what we call these think tanks. And
Yeah.
And what's always amazing is for £2 or £3 million a year, they get huge traction. They get 5,000 media hits a year for £2 or £3 million. And a Tory MP told me when I was writing my book, Guto Bebb, a former Tory minister, said, if he wants to influence British politics and need £250,000, he wouldn't give it to a party, he'd give it to a think tank. So that's because you got this small amount of money on one level. So that's part of the story, I think. But what we've also seen is actually the rise of big money in Britain. The amount of money that's gone into British politics in the last few years is much bigger. Whereas when I first started doing this work, even back in 2017, £50,000 was a decent big sum of money to donate to a political party. Now it's millions. The last election, we saw, upwards of 30, 40 million raised. But we've also just seen people like Frank Hester, the kind of disgraced Tory donor, gave £15 million. Elon Musk, there's talk of $100 million. So we are seeing a change as well. So more money is coming into the system. So that's happening at the same time. And we just don't have, as you say, these kind of checks and balances. Our lobbying laws are absolutely atrocious. I often report on what's happening in Britain through American filings. I'm able to find documents in American filings, whether they're charity documents or lobbying register documents, that can tell me about what's happening in Britain that I can't find in Britain, that are not publicly accessible documents in Britain. And that's because our laws on almost all of these things are so awful. The Lobbying Act, which David Cameron brought in, misses something like 94% of lobbying, Transparency International found. So, I actually think we'd be better off with no lobbying legislation at all, because if there's no lobbying legislation, it will be talked about all the time.
Yeah.
But because we have some, and it's awful, we kind of don't.
Gives the illusion.
It gives the illusion. And a lot of time, this is what we have. Exactly that, Jane. The illusion of accountability. But when you actually dig deep, there really is very little there.
But why has there been this big increase in the money that's coming in and the super donors? Because I have to admit, that is a trend that I wasn't aware of. What is so kind of interesting and desirable about British politics that people want to put these sums of money into it?
My ad hoc, thinking the worst of people would be the COVID PPE scandal, where you saw political donors, the National Audit Office, which is a very august body and very good at these sort of things. They found that political donors and politically connected people were 10 times more likely to be put in what was called a VIP lane for COVID contracts and be given these huge, sometimes £1 billion COVID contracts. when I've been doing all this work over the last few years, I've often thought maybe I'm too far. Maybe I'm over egging this pudding. Maybe it's not quite as bad as I'm saying it is. And what the PP scandal showed me was I was like, wow, this is actually worse than I thought it was. But what I think it also did was showed donors that access can buy you influence, that money will buy you influence. Money is going to talk. I don't think it's a coincidence that Frank Hester's entire business, Frank Hester had never given to politics until about a year before the Tories lost office, or maybe 2 years. He apparently said he used to be a Green voter. His entire business, Frank Hester's entire business, is contracts to the National Health Service, at which he makes an operating profit of about 40% on, which is humongous. I could totally see why someone in that situation would want to try and influence the government. Of course you would. And if it doesn't work out, what's 10 or 15 million pounds on those sorts of returns? So I think this is it. I think it showed, again, the transactional nature of it. I think that is part of it.
I was just going to say, for the benefit of our American listeners, that the PPE is personal protective equipment, so just the basics that medical staff needed to be able to function in the COVID environment. And this was an area where there were scandals that got huge attention in the UK, because at that time, COVID was touching everybody and people were angry about the procurement scandals. They were also angry later on when they found out that the top people in the government had been enjoying parties like literally minutes after telling everyone else they couldn't see their relatives. But now people are not necessarily making those same connections. I mean, one of the big issues is about future health spending and how long do you have to wait to see a doctor and things like this in the UK, but people aren't necessarily making the connections to political influence and government waste, because this stuff that you're talking about affects everybody if we, the taxpayer, end up paying inflated prices for some of the basics that the healthcare system needs.
It's something that you see in America. It's something I found myself thinking more and more about, is that actually the way to really make big returns is through the state. Whether you're a private company that wants to try and change laws for your benefit, or you're looking for state contracts, or both. Look at someone like Peter Thiel, who's Elon Musk's kind of bestie. They were in PayPal together. He incubated a kind of whole generation of MAGA Republicans, essentially. Most famously, J.D. Vance. He's bankrolled Trump. And, Thiel is very, a democracy agnostic, let's think, is probably being a kind way of putting it. And he's very much about, getting rid of the state, etc. Except for the fact that the bits of the state that Peter Thiel's companies like Palantir live off, in terms of Palantir which is Peter Thiel's kind of big tech surveillance company. They are just state plays. The money that they get is state plays. They do some private work, but the vast majority is large state contracts. I think when I first started doing this work, I probably thought that ideology was the driving motivation more often than not for people's involvement in politics. I'm not saying there's not some, but I think the overlap between ideology and economic interest is probably even stronger than I had thought it was when I first started doing this work.
Yeah, that there's a real return on investment. So let's turn to the US. I think one of the really striking moments of the end of the Biden presidency has been to see the most powerful man in the world, even if he was the lame duck version, but still the president of the United States standing up there and saying there's too much concentration of power in the hands of a new oligarchy. And I'm wondering, is he right? I think there will be many people that look at him and think, well, there's a lot of concentration of power in your hands. What is it? Are you just being a bad loser? But we are seeing with social media and potentially with AI, certain tech owners becoming incredibly influential in ways that we just don't fathom. I think it's taken us nearly 2 decades of having social media to start to understand how it affects us. And with AI, this issue might be growing exponentially, that's going to shape our society and our communications and our education system, and we can't see inside it and understand how it works. Is the new economy taking us into a new era of influence, and how do we begin to understand that?
I think it is. I think it's something I've been trying to think about in recent weeks, and it's changing. I think this is changing a lot. I think for someone like me who looked at money is a kind of tangible enough thing that you can see it goes in or it comes out, and sometimes you can't see it. So your job is to try and find it or see where it pops up in the system. What you're seeing now, I think, is something, it's akin to money, but also very different, which is, most kind of visibly Elon Musk, for example. Elon Musk's desire to become involved in electoral contests, not just the United States, where he spent upwards of 200 million, was giving people $1 million a day on Twitter effectively to vote Republican, but also in, you saw him talk about him donation to reform, supporting reform, calling for Tommy Robinson, the far right leader in Britain, to be released from a contempt of court sentence. We've seen him say he wants to support the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right party in Germany. He's friends with Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy in Italy, etc. But even what you're seeing in other platforms, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg, the ownership as well. We saw with Jeff Bezos and in the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos stopping the Washington Post from putting an endorsement for Kamala Harris ahead of the presidential election, which is not, I don't think about. It's not like any Washington Post voter's mind would have been changed by that endorsement or not.
No.
But it's way more about the signals you're sending.
Yeah.
It's the signals you're sending up the food chain, but the signals you're sending into the wider world as well. And I think that's a huge change. Like, how do you say, take Elon Musk, for example. So Elon Musk says he wants to donate $100 million to reform. So people like me go, look, we need new laws, which we do, around electoral interference, which we do, all of these things. What if Elon Musk stands back and goes, I'm not going to bother. I have this shell company in the UK, but I'm not going to route the money through that, which is a way of getting around the current laws. I'm just going to spend my day blasting on Twitter. And we had about 6 weeks of the grooming gang story, which just came out of Elon Musk. The extent to which mainstream media now lags, not just social media, not what's said on social media, but the social media oligarchs, how they're able to set the agenda. Like, we move off this thing from X was said on Twitter today to the owner of X said this, or the owner of Facebook or Meta said this. And that's the huge step change that we're seeing. And how do you even quantify that? How do you put a figure on an Elon Musk tweet as an act of political interference? Like, I don't know the answer to that. And I think that's a huge change. That is an absolutely and utterly profound change. And I think that's the kind of thing that Biden is speaking to. This sense that, why would you give money to the Institute of Economic Affairs to kind of lobby on an issue, maybe with some success, maybe with not much success, when you've got GB News who can just go straight to the source? Would pay a Reform MP to interview a Tory MP to come up with a soundbite that then hits the 6 o'clock news. The attention economy effectively has become the driving force, or at least is in certain aspects of our politics a far more driving force than just the financial side of it, just the political finance side of it.
Well, after the break, we're going to hear more from Peter on how we can order the disorder. So, Peter, as someone who is studying these massive global problems in detail, tell us more about what we can do to change things. How can we restore faith in democracy? And that could be anything from what we want our governments to do to what we as individuals could do.
One of the big issues, I think, at the moment is because it feels like we are living in many respects in Donald Trump's world, but an Elon Musk's world. But I think it feels at the moment like it's a very reactive way of living. We're just sitting here on a little lifeboat, like hanging on for dear life, hoping he doesn't say something that's particularly obnoxious or do something that's particularly obnoxious. And it might all go away in 4 years' time. And I think democratic governments are doing that too. They're hoping against hope that things will be okay. Like, it's a very, like, oh God, he's after Greenland. Well, maybe that's not bad. We don't have anything to do with Greenland, so let him do that.
Could it be a joke? That's literally what people are trying to work out.
Yeah. So all that's, and I think there's a bit of agency that democratic governments have, especially around, if not vis-a-vis the United States government, vis-a-vis companies. Every company that operates in a country does so under a license from the government of that country. Like, in some ways we could re-own some of the populist language around sovereignty. Democratic governments of nation states are sovereign. They have sovereign powers. They can use them. They can act. They can bring in laws and legislations. They can decide not to give government contracts to certain companies who are doing certain things, if their owners are doing certain things. They can decide to bring in legislation on various issues. They can decide to bring in legislation on foreign interference in politics. They can bring in legislation on money and politics. It will not solve all of these problems, but I think it would help to start feeling like there's agency here. I think it's quite striking. Like, for example, the grooming gang story started actually to slide down when Keir Starmer basically told Elon Musk to F off. That was effectively it. And once that happened, the air started to perforate out of it. And I think that's quite important to show that the democratically elected governments have power. It isn't just at the behest of a kind of tech oligarchy to set the political agenda, to set what we do, to set the conversations. And I think that's one place that's really important. I do also think the overarching architecture of our democracy, and it's not as politicized as it is in the US, thankfully. The Conservatives in the UK have definitely tried to politicize it. Voter ID was an attempt to politicize the architecture of democracy. I think we're going to see more of that. But despite that, it isn't as politicized as it is in the United States, which I think is a good thing. And so there is opportunities to actually do things to kind of tighten up some of these rules and regulations. And I think at the same time, you have to ask some of these trust issues. What is driving mistrust in our politics? What is driving this huge lack of faith in institutions? And I think part of it does come from this sense that, like the stories I told you about, the cash for access. And I think that all has a huge impact on people. We see it. It's like a bum, 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 bum. And especially in a rolling news media where these stories can reverberate and reverberate and reverberate. And tackling all of that and doing so in a way that actually says we're going to do this. Do you know what? We know you don't like it. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to be on the front foot. And I think a lot of the time, progressive politicians in particular, or even just what you might call mainstream politicians, I think have been very, very wary of being on the front foot on these things. There's been a sense of actually, okay, we're going to like accepting a narrative framing, which effectively is framed by an intranet worldview, shall we say, a great replacement theory worldview, a kind of, that sort of worldview has framed a lot of the conversations that we have. And I think until elected governments, until people in general start to push back against this will continue to be the frame. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything. But I think it's really important to start to go, okay, what things could we do? How could we reframe all of this? How could we talk about these things differently? What do people want to see? What's the feeling? Why do people feel this disconnect? And I can see it in the comments and the stories I write. Keir Starmer is corrupt. I don't think Keir Starmer is corrupt. What I think he hasn't done is to understand where that view comes from with people and to try to understand it. We saw early on his premiership, the whole there was a bit of a scandal around gifts that were given, glasses and clothes. On one level, it looks really trivial compared to what the Conservative government, I would agree, it was quite trivial. But I thought the response to it showed a failure to understand how this works. Keir Starmer was like, everyone gets gifts. It's like, no, the problem is people do not like this system. People think you are all in it for yourself. And this is the opportunity. I think Labour missed a huge opportunity in that moment very early to go, do you know what? Everybody's been doing this. Just because everyone's doing this isn't right. Here's a new system. You have the nodal principles, all of this stuff. We're going to go back to basics. And I think this has been the problem. I think governments, far from actually embracing open government and say, actually, do you know what we do? And some people there'll always be a rump of people who are completely skeptic and cynical and don't like you. And that you have to just accept. But for the mainstay, we're going to be open and we're going to be transparent. We're going to respond to questions. We're not going to create this kind of citadel. We're not going to create this kind of siege mentality. Unfortunately, I see across the piece from government to government an absolute failure to even think about that and to do that. And I think that's part of why we've ended up in this place around democracy and around a sense of a lack of trust, really.
Well, it's a knee-jerk reaction of defensiveness and fear, and I think there is a bit of a vicious circle. Politicians feel that they're more attacked than ever because of social media, and so they go into this defensive posture. They don't have the instinct of sharing information, and then it all makes it worse. But it's usually when a government's new that they do move on things like freedom of information. And it seems somehow that the current British government isn't really in that place, not coming in with the confidence of a 1997 Tony Blair, even though we have a parliament where most of the MPs are new, which is something incredible. And everyone that I know that is engaging with Parliament is talking about this wave of parliamentary energy and engagement, and all these people that have come into politics after doing a wide variety of different roles and genuinely want to do something. But it doesn't really translate into the government level, which still feels very defensive. So there's going to be something just about leadership and about boldness in all of this, ambition.
I think it is. I'm very heartened by some of the people that are in Parliament. I mean, after that story came out about Prigozhin and the regulator's failure decision that the law firm that had let him take the slap case had done nothing wrong, a Labour MP, Lloyd Hatton, stood up in Parliament and asked a question of a Labour minister, the Labour Minister of Justice, about this case and said, what are we going to do? And I think that shows, I think there is definitely a level amongst many backbenchers who care about issues. Lloyd Houghton used to work for Margaret Hodge, knows a lot about anti-corruption work, and cares and is knowledgeable about these issues. Is not somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. And there's a lot of that there. And I see it myself, just like I have a very similar experience, John. I talk to politicians who are really engaged. And what I find particularly frustrating really is we had a opposition talk a good game on a lot of these issues too, because they did seem to understand this. And I think there was this thing about inertia in office, and I think there's something about, like, if you want to learn anything from Trump and Trump's first week, it's about taking power and action. And I think there's something about, like, if you want to just look at British politics, the Conservatives have never struggled to take action when in power. If you look at what they did say in the coalition government very quickly, some very radical changes. I never heard them. They weren't talking about a two-term government, which is what the Labour Party. You talk people probably to say that's a term 2 issue. You mightn't have a term 2. Term 1 is the place. Yeah. So this does not bolted on. And I think there is this, there's a kind of, to me, it kind of mirrors the close analogy, I think, is what you saw with centre-left parties in government when the financial crash happened. There's a lot of centre-left parties in government across Europe when the financial crash happened. And they really struggled to imagine something that wasn't the response, the austerity response, which actually was completely disastrous for them.
When you think about what people can do on an individual level, I mean, I think we are seeing all around us a lot of people reacting against Elon Musk and his new role in politics and reaching into Germany and the UK and so on. A lot of people are deciding not to be on X anymore and to move over to Blue Sky. We have our Disorder account on Blue Sky now, for example.
I'm there too, yeah. I've pretty much given up on Twitter too. It's a terrible place, and you'll find me on Blue Sky.
And does it help? Is it worthwhile? I also have this worry that people will migrate into different platforms for different viewpoints, I worry that it increases the chances of liberals going into a liberal bubble and, angry people being in an angry bubble, or, however you want to draw the map. I just worry if it cuts across our ability to have the difficult conversations and if we start more living in these filter bubble worlds.
I think the challenge, and I think that was the kind of argument, and I probably stayed on X for quite a long time around X, and the place I got to was actually less, you were talking about it. The problem is people are kind of accused of creating their own filter bubbles, but the problem is the filter bubbles are created by algorithms, and they're created by algorithms that we cannot see. And algorithms are incredibly influential to our politics and our public life that we just cannot see. I think if anyone spent much time on X in the last few months, they would have said, why am I seeing all this crazy right-wing content?
Yeah,
why am I seeing Elon Musk in every...
Yeah, and this is unrelated to what I've clicked on.
Well, exactly. And I think that exactly is the issue. I think when it comes to... And that will be my issue with Twitter. The optimistic early days of the internet around information, around the ability to kind of reach consensus. I remember covering the Arab Spring. I remember being in Egypt just after the Arab Spring, reporting,
Oh, wow, this was I didn't know you were there. Yeah, a huge
This was a moment, and it felt like an incredibly emancipatory moment.
Yeah.
And potentially transformative around the world. And for that to now end up in this place where these are division machines, these are divisions, machines to sow division more than anything else, I think has been huge. There's a huge part of me that wants to kind of reach into the sense of both sides. I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter. I want to say they said this and they said that. But if we look at what's happening, say, in the United States at the moment, and I was listening to one episode of the daily podcast from the New York Times before the 2024 election, and they were talking about housing policy. So they're saying, look, we're going to discuss housing policy, the two candidates' housing policy. They started off with Kamala Harris, and she's going to... you got a cash injection if you were a first-time buyer, and they were talking about how this would work. Would it cause inflation in the housing market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Would it actually mean cheaper houses? Then it came to Donald Trump. His main policy is deporting about over 10 million undocumented workers. And that was then discussed purely as a housing policy. It's unknown. We don't really know how that's going to work. No one's really tried this before. The impact on the market is yet to be... What? It's not a housing policy. It's a nativist policy. And I think that's one of the challenges with this, is like how to engage with things like that in a way that is both true and doesn't reify all of these divisions. But I think pretending that these are two sides of the same coin is a fallacy, because it's not true.
And there has to be something about how we have real debates about policy that is a bit clearer to people and doesn't result in people just saying, okay, well, stopping all migration is the answer.
And even just like the kind of frames what you're talking about doing. I think that what's interesting with Biden, and I think there needs to be a lot of reflection on this, and I think this hasn't happened yet, and I'll be interested what comes out of America, was he tried to run on a democracy ticket, basically, for the last 4 years. Save democracy, vote for me. And by the time he got to the election, most Americans went, I feel poor, so I'm going to vote for the other guy. And saving democracy didn't work as a, and I think that's quite useful and informative. This has to be married to other things. It can't just be a project that's about new Nolan principles. I think for a lot of ordinary people they went, and I think the word democracy in many ways, it's been a long abused term. It is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Like, how democratic is it? It was a Democratic Republic of Germany, the GDR, which was the former East Germany. Again, not known for its democratic policy. And so I think that's, there's a language issue there as well about how do we even talk about these things.
Yeah, well, it comes back to, that idea of the pyramid of needs that, human beings have got material needs at the bottom that need to be satisfied for you to literally stay alive and for you to be able to do things like get on the internet and read the other stuff, or talk to people. And it also makes me think back to what you mentioned about the Arab Spring and Egypt. There were millions of people across the Arab world calling for democracy and an end to dictatorship, but that was never going to work if the economies were collapsing around them. That was one of the big problems. You had Tunisia, for a while, the longest lasting experiment with democracy, but because the economy was suffering so badly for various reasons, it ended up going back to authoritarianism. And I think that's not a Middle East issue. That's just a human issue. We all need to be able to feed our kids and have a roof over our heads and stuff like that. And it's interesting that a lot of left parties don't seem to have a good answer to that when this should be part of what the left has to offer. But I guess the left also gets quite divided over how you actually do fix the economy and the role of the state and so on. And it can get easier to do the identity politics stuff that doesn't really offer people much except more emotions, Peter, it's been super useful and interesting talking to you. I hope we'll have you back on the show again in the future. I've got one last question for you. If you found yourself somehow in a lift with Keir Starmer and you've got that 1 minute to tell him something to do to clean up the money and the influence in British politics, what would you say to him?
One line: cap political donations. We should cap political donations at quite a low figure, and that should be it. I think that would be the most important thing we could do. There's lots of other things someone like me could tell him to do, but knowing the way politicians are, you have to give them, I think, a simple ask. Cap political donations. The Commission Standards on Public Life suggested £10,000 a year. I would agree. Do that, and a lot of the other stuff becomes a lot easier on the other side.
That is perfect. I love the way you've got it into 3 words there. It's take back control, but this one is cap political donations, and that would do so much good. Pithy and perfect. It has been great talking with you, Peter. Good luck with your work, and we hope to be in touch again. So, to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please tap follow to get every episode as soon as it launches. And for more on this and to read some further background and see some of Peter's articles, you can subscribe to our Substack. The link is in the show notes. The producer is George McDonagh. The executive producer is Neil Fearn. Thank you for listening and hope you have an orderly week.